Hi, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. Our mission here at Fresh Hope for Mental Health is to empower you to live well in spite of your mental health challenge by sharing insights through interviews, practical tools for living well, encouragement, and courage for overcoming all from a Christian perspective. And now, here's your host, Pastor Brad Hafes.
Hello, and welcome to this edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend some time listening to this podcast. I'm glad to have you with me. Today, it's just going to be me. I'd like to talk to you about some cognitive distortions, distorted ways of looking at things, distorted ways of thinking about things. And quite honestly, we all have many of these, but many times those of us who have a mental health challenge or have a lot of emotional pain that has never really been dealt with and worked through, or if you've had a lot of trauma in your life, many times what happens is our filtering system gets real messed up. You know, what we think and what we believe and the events that happen outside of us come into this filter, so to speak, and then go into our brain. And our brain kind of holds that filtering system, if you will. And then it kind of goes through what we believe deep down and then what we think. And then that has a lot to do with how we behave. And it's very simple, if you will. If you want to change what you do, you've got to change how you think and look at things, because you even have to go back a step farther into what you believe deep down, because that's really where our actions come from. And so often in our thinking, we've got to clean up that filter. We've got to clean up those distortions. So cognitive distortion is really ways that our mind convinces us of something that really isn't true. And they're inaccurate thoughts. And they're usually used to enforce negative thinking or emotions, which are going to many times cause us to act certain ways and to behave in ways that many times are self-sabotaging or hurtful to ourselves or hurtful to others. So I want to talk about some cognitive distortions that Aaron Beck first proposed the theory behind cognitive distortions, and David Burns was responsible for popularizing it within common names and examples for the distortions. So I'm going to talk about some of those that he has popularized, if you will, and how he summarized the distortions. The first one is filtering. This is when you take negative details and you magnify them while filtering out all positive aspects of a situation. For instance, a person may pick out a single unpleasant detail and they dwell on it exclusively, that their vision of reality becomes darkened or distorted. Oh, that's so easy to do, isn't it? It's so easy to have something happen and then you just focus and obsess on that one little negative thing. And I'll tell you what, if you have a brain chemistry issue, you start doing that, your brain chemistry is even going to go more crazy, if you will. The second one is polarized thinking, or black and white thinking, polarized between two poles. In polarizing thinking, things are either black or white. You have to be perfect or you're a failure. There is no middle ground. It's much like the world we live in these days, isn't it? You place people or situations in either or categories with no shades of gray or allowing for the complexity most people and situations have. Most situations are gray. Most situations and difficulties have good and bad, black and white. And if your performance falls short of perfect, you see yourself as a total failure. That's a lie. It's a distorted way of looking at things. Black and white thinking is dangerous for your brain. Thirdly, overgeneralization. In this distortion, you come to a general conclusion based on a single incident or a single piece of evidence or very little evidence. And if something bad happens only once, you expect it to happen over and over again. A person may see a single unpleasant event as a part of a never-ending pattern of defeat. And many times what we think is going to happen over and over is a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will, especially if it's us and our own behavior. This kind of distortion will just easily become so easy to do. You just overgeneralize about everything. Well, you always, and this always, and it never, ever happens that you do this. And it's based upon very little of any kind of accumulated facts, and maybe even just one incident. The fourth kind of cognitive distortion that David Burns came to group together, so to speak, is called jumping to conclusions. Without individuals saying so, we know that what they are feeling and why they act the way they do. In particular, we're able to determine how people are feeling towards us. And we assume that, one of the dangerous things when you're doing this, jumping to conclusions, is that you can finish the other person's sentence. My wife and I end up doing this to one another after 38 years of marriage. It's easy to do that and jump to conclusions of what the other person is going to say. And sometimes it irritates me so much that I will say, well, what was I going to say when she interrupts me? And then I'm ornery enough to pretend like that's what I was not going to say. Many of us do this, and I do it a lot. Jump to conclusions if somebody's acting a certain way, or a person may conclude that someone's reacting negatively towards them, but doesn't really bother to find out if they're correct. They just assume it. Number 5, I came from a family who does this. Catastrophizing. We expect disaster to strike no matter what. If you do this, this will happen and it will be horrible. And it's always referred to as magnifying or minimizing. We hear about a problem and use what-if questions. What if it happens to me? What if tragedy strikes? What if this were to happen? You might exaggerate the importance of insignificant events such as someone else's mistake or someone else's achievement, or you may inappropriately shrink the magnitude of significant events until they appear tiny. Catastrophizing is when you just always assume the worst. How horrible. And it hasn't even happened. There's many times where you and I lose sleep over stuff that has never happened. We were worried that it would, and we ended up staying up and pacing and not being able to sleep, and then it never happened. The next one is one that is easy to do also. It's a cognitive distortion. It's a faulty way of looking at something. That is personalization. Personalization is a distortion where a person believes that everything others do or say is some kind of direct personal reaction to their person. We also compare ourselves to others, trying to determine who's smarter, better looking. A person engaging in personalization may also see themselves as the cause of some unhealthy external event that they were not even responsible for. For example, we were late to a dinner party and caused the hostess to overcook the meal. If I had only pushed my husband to leave on time, this wouldn't have happened. Well, simply not the case. The 7th type of cognitive distortions are control fallacies. If we feel externally controlled, we see ourselves as the helpless victim of fate. For example, I can't help it if the quality of the work is poor. My boss demanded I work overtime on it. the fallacy of internal control has us assuming responsibility for the pain and happiness of everyone around us. For example, why aren't you happy? Is it because something I did? We actually have the fallacy that we have that much control on others. The next cognitive distortion is fallacy of fairness. Oh my, this one's easy to fall into. We feel resentful because we think we know what is fair, but other people won't always agree with us. And as our parents told us, when we're growing up and something doesn't go our way, my parents said, well, life isn't fair. People go through life applying a measuring ruler against every situation, judging it as either being fair, right, or unfair and wrong. And things will not always work out in your favor. Life isn't fair, even when you think it should be. It's not. The ninth cognitive distortion is blaming. This one is when we hold the other person responsible for our pain, or take the other track and blame ourselves for every problem, for every example. Stop making me feel bad about myself. So we either blame ourselves or we blame other people. Nobody can make you feel a particular way. Only you have control over your own emotions and emotional reactions. The 10th cognitive distortion are the shoulds. So we make a list of ironclad rules about how others should behave and how we should behave, and people who break the rules make us angry, and we feel guilty when we violate these rules. A person may often believe that they are trying to motivate themselves with shoulds and shouldn'ts as if they have to be punished before they can do anything. For example, I really should exercise. I shouldn't be so lazy. Musts and oughts are also offenders. The emotional consequence is guilt. When a person directs should statements towards other, it's because they feel anger, frustration, resentment, and they want to control the other person. Number 11, emotional reasoning. In this cognitive distortion, we believe that whatever we feel must automatically be true. In other words, if you feel stupid, that means you're stupid. If you feel unloved, it means that you're unloved. And so you assume that whatever you're feeling is always absolutely true, even if the emotions that you're feeling are unhealthy or your feelings are based upon some sort of lie that you're believing deep down in your heart of hearts. I feel it, therefore it must be true. Well, you can feel, even if it's an unhealthy feeling, but then you have to get behind the feeling and find out if it's based upon reality. The 12th distortion is the fallacy of change. We expect that other people will change to suit us if we just pressure them or cajole them enough. We need to change people because our hopes for happiness seem to depend entirely on them. Boy, all of these just sound too true, don't they? The fallacy of changing someone else. I've seen that as a pastor over the years, 30-some years of pastoring. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of couples that I've married. And inevitably, someone goes into that marriage thinking that they need to change their spouse. They need to change that other person so that their happiness can really be reached. Well, let's go on to number 13. Number 13 is called global labeling. That's where you generalize one or two qualities into a negative global judgment. So there's extreme forms of generalization. It's even more than just generalizing. And they're also referred to as labeling or mislabeling. Instead of describing an error in context of a specific situation, a person will will attach an unhealthy label to themselves. For example, they may say, I'm a loser in a situation where they failed at a specific task. And when someone else's behavior rubs a person the wrong way, they may attach an unhealthy label to him, such as he's a real jerk. Mislabeling involves describing an event with language that is highly colored and emotionally loaded. For example, instead of saying someone drops her children off at daycare every day, a person who is mislabeling might say she abandons her children to strangers every day. Boy, those kinds of things cut and hurt and break relationships. Yet it's a distorted way of looking at things. The 14th one is one that I have known all too well in my life prior to medication, and somewhat since then too, of course, but that is always being right. We are continually on a trial to prove that our opinions and our actions are correct. Being wrong is unthinkable, and we will go to any length to demonstrate our rightness. In fact, we'll even prove that what we did was based upon someone else's actions. He made me do it. She made me do it. For example, I don't care how badly arguing makes you feel. I'm going to win this argument no matter what because I'm right. Being right often is more important than the feelings of others around a person who engages in this cognitive distortion. Sometimes you can be so right that you're wrong because you hurt the other person. Sometimes we forget that maybe the relationship is more important than being right. And many times when we think we're right, we're wrong. Number 15, heaven's reward fallacy. This kind of cognitive distortion is when we expect the sacrifice and self-denial that we do as a victim or as a person who's always giving, as if someone was keeping score. We feel bitter when we don't see the reward coming. This is when you do things for other people and expect them to act a certain way after you've done something for them or done something for a friend, and the friend doesn't respond the way you think they should. Well, we're going to talk about, and you'll want to check out another podcast that's a partner to this podcast, and that is, how do you fix cognitive distortions? How do you change them? What I'd like you to do at the end of this podcast is really sit down with these 15 and kind of think about, how many of them do you do? How many of them do you have? And granted, we all have some of these to varying degrees, but how do you fix it? How do you clean out that filtering system? That's what we're going to talk about in part 2 of this. We will look at, how do you fix cognitive distortions? Well, my friend, I hope this hasn't been discouraging to you. It would be easy to hear these 15 and say, oh my gosh, I'm doing all 15. I'll never be able to overcome this. But I want to tell you, there's hope. You can. And with God's help, all things are possible. Nothing is impossible. So I want you to listen to part 2 of this. And in the meantime, if you feel led, I'd really like to hear from you in an email. You can email me at pastorbrad@freshhope.us. I'd love to hear your insights, your questions, other topics you'd like me to talk about. And you can even leave a voicemail on our podcast website, which is freshhopeformentalhealth.com. And if you'd like to connect with us on Facebook or Twitter, you can find us in both places. We also have a YouTube channel that has a number of insightful videos. And now we have also an app for Fresh Hope, which puts all of our resources at your fingertips. So it's a mobile download, or it's an app for mobile devices. Your iPad, any kind of pads for Android and Apple, you just go to your store, type in Fresh Hope, and the app should come up. It's a free download. And I'd encourage you, because we have videos in there, and we're making more and more of them all the time, of people, just regular people, encouraging one another. If you would, tell your friends about this program. We're glad that you listened. I hope it's helpful. I had a lot of those distorted ways of thinking, and by God's grace, He changed my thinking. And it took work, but it happened. Lord Jesus, I just ask that the person listening to this right now, my friend, that you give them comfort and that you give them peace. Help us, Lord, to clean up our thinking and to see things the way you see them, to perceive life through your filter. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, my friend, until next time, may the Lord fill you with his hope, which is fresh and new daily. Until then, I'm Brad Hafes, and this has been another edition of Fresh Hope for Mental Health.
You've been listening to Fresh Hope for Mental Health. If you have an opportunity, please review, share, and subscribe to the Fresh Hope for Mental Health podcast on iTunes or on the service that you use. We encourage you to share our podcast on social media with your friends and family. Previous podcasts of Fresh Hope for Mental Health can be found at freshhopeformentalhealth.com, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Radio, and iTunes. Fresh Hope is one of the leading networks of faith-based peer support groups internationally. For more information about Fresh Hope, go to freshhope.us.